All right, we are in our last video here to get our character animation setup going. So right now we have our idle and our running states set up correctly. The transitions are set up correctly. We just need to control this animation parameter with our script for our character. So I'm going to go into my rigid body character controller script, and I'm going to make a variable for that animation parameter. I guess, yeah. So might seem confusing, but it's gonna actually be an int, because the best way to reference the animation parameters in code is with something called a hash. So what you do is you give this thing a name. I'm gonna call it what did I call it in the actual editor? I called it movement input. So I'm going to call this thing movement input anim param, just to clarify that this is an animation parameter thing. It's not something I'm using for anything else. And I'm going to set it equal to animator dot string to hash. So if you use the static string to hash method in the animator class and you pass in the name of the animation you're trying to deal with, which we said was called movement input, and it's going to be really important that you get this exactly right. So I'm going to actually copy that text and I'm going to paste it here. And it looks like I had it right, but better safe than sorry. And now we have a variable for it, so I'll never have to type it by hand again, which is good, because when you type it by hand, you're inviting user error, right? So it's best to, instead of just using like magic strings, which is just like a string with no context, we're going to make a variable for that. And in this case, we're making a special one that's actually an int, because there's just an optimization built into the Unity animator where you can use this string to hash thing to get the name of an animation parameter saved as an int variable. So that's why it's an int. And I guess I can make this thing, can I make it read only? Maybe that's even a little better, so that we're never changing the value of this. We know it's always going to be this. And next, we have to decide when it makes sense to update that parameter, so that, and by update it, I mean like change its value here. Send this the value that we're getting from our code. And I think it makes sense if we go all the way down. We have this onMove method that gets called by the player input component using the new input system. So again, you might remember this. The way our setup is working is we're using the new player input component, and our input actions have an input called move. It's a vector2. It's going to happen whenever the left stick is moved or WASD is pressed. And so that is when we want to change the value of our input animation parameter. So what I'm going to do here, I guess I need a reference to the animator. So we're going to make a new variable of the type animator, and I'll just use the lowercase name animator for it. This is going to be a reference to the actual animator component on our game object. So if you remember, the rigid body character controller script here is on the player game object, but the animator is on the model game object, which is actually a child of the player. So we can't just use get component like we probably want to, like we're doing for these other components. Instead, we have to we could make this a serialized field and drag it in, which if we had like multiple animators in different children of this object, that's what I would do, because That way we could specify the correct animator that we care about. In this case, there's only one animator in this game object hierarchy, but it's just not on the root game object. It's in one of the children game objects. So just to kind of demonstrate a different function, I will show you one called getComponent in children. So you can see it down here, and works the same way. It's just going to search the game object and all its children for the first instance of a component that matches the type that I put in, which will be animator in this case. So this way we can search down in the hierarchy for all of the instances of animator and then return the first one we find and store it in this variable. So now we have a reference to an instance of animator. That's the one we care about. And just to clarify why we didn't need that here is because string to hash is a static method, so you do not need an instance of an animator to use a static method. But when we try to do animator.setBool, it needs to know which instance of an animator are we trying to set the bool on, because we could have all kinds of different animators, or every character in the game could have its own animator. They don't all share one. So it's important to specify which instance, and that's why we have to do this business here. All right, now back to on move. I'm going to say animator with the lowercase a, which is the instance of the animator that we need to use. It's not set bool, it's actually we're using set float, and we need to tell it what is the, you can see int id. You probably are more accustomed to using string name, but int id is actually the first version of this method. And we have an int for the ID of this animator, or this animation parameter, and it's called movement input anim param. And then the value we want to pass in, so our input is actually a vector 2, but what we can do is say input dot magnitude, which will kind of tell us the quote unquote length of that vector, and that's going to be a float. So basically when we are moving our analog stick, we can either move it on the up and down y-axis or the left and right horizontal x-axis. But if we want to measure the magnitude, it's kind of measuring how far from the center or the origin we've moved that analog stick. So in other words, if we haven't moved it at all, the magnitude would be 0. And if we've moved it all the way to the edge, the magnitude would be 1, no matter what direction we're moving it in. So magnitude, when they say it gets the length of the vector, this is kind of a good way to visualize that. It's the distance from the center origin position of your analog stick all the way to the wherever the player has moved it. So that's what's going on there. And this is all I think we need. So I'm going to save. I'm going to go back to Unity and we can test our game as soon as it's done compiling here. All right, it's compiled. I will hit play. And click in my game window, and yeah, I'm walking. You can see, so my friction is pretty low for a human walking on regular ground. Like you can see she kind of slides around when she's trying to stop. So I would probably crank up my stopping friction. You can also see, like, when I change directions, I'm like sliding in the direction I used to be going before I start going in the new direction. So I would adjust a lot of my friction settings to make this look more correct for a human on regular ground. It basically looks like I'm on ice right now. So like if you get on the actual ice, it'll be even more pronounced, right? Like now I'm sliding a ton. And I guess what you might do is make a, maybe you would have like a sliding animation if you really wanted. But what I would do probably to suit most gameplay applications here is fix my friction so that I accelerate more quickly and have higher friction when I'm trying to stop. So I would probably have higher friction just in general, especially when I'm trying to stop. And the higher friction in general would help me no longer slide when I switch directions. And the higher acceleration would help me have enough force when I move to overcome that higher friction when the player's actually trying to move. Anyway, that is what I would do next to fix this for realistic seeming movement, or maybe not realistic, but more fun in a typical game movement. But the thing we were working on is getting the animations to play, and that is working. So hopefully you can use this system to take advantage of all of the crazy animations you see on Mixamo, which is really powerful. All right, I will see you all next time. Actually, I guess before I go sign off, let's go ahead and save everything and commit one last time. So we will say that we update the animation, the movement animation parameter in code. That's good enough. All right, cool. See you all next time.